Hello, welcome to Guide London. My name's Nick Salmond. I'm a London Blue Badge tourist guide and one of around 600 members of the Association of Professional Tourist Guides, and that's the organisation behind the Guide London YouTube channel, behind our website, behind our Twitter feed and our Facebook page. We represent 600 Blue Badge tourist guides who are used to taking people across London to showing them the wonders of this city. But of course, we can't do that at the moment because we're still just about in lockdown. So we've been producing a series of videos over the last year to bring a little bit of London to you. If you've been able to join us, you'll find videos on the history of London, over some of the people who've lived in the city and also some of the culture. Do go and search on our YouTube channel or on Facebook to find the videos. They're all sitting there. There's nearly 70 videos on different aspects of London that you can search through our archive. Now, we broadcast these videos every Tuesday at this time, which is 4 p.m. in the UK, or it's 11 a.m. if you're on the east coast of the United States. Now, today we're going to look into London's dark past. Now, in the past, if you ended up on the wrong side of history, if you ended up supporting the wrong monarch or ended up supporting the wrong religion, then you might meet a very grisly fate. You might end up at the hands of the public executioner. Many famous people in London's history lost their lives at the hands of the public executioner. So today we're going to look at some of the execution sites in London. And to do that, I'm joined today by a London Blue Badge tourist guide, Katherine Orcott. Now, you probably know Katherine because she's been presenting some of our broadcasts here on a Tuesday. Today she's going to do all the work. She's going to tell us all about some of the famous people who've lost their lives at the execution site, some of the sites where they are in London, what you can see if you visit them today, and some of the famous people who lost their lives there. So do send in any questions you have for us. Just put them in the comments on Facebook or YouTube, and we'll pick them up at the end of the presentation. But without more ado, I'll hand over to Katherine.
Well, thank you very much, Nick, and thank you for joining us, everybody. Good to have you all. Thank you for joining me for, as Nick says, this slightly dark and disturbing trip down history's forgotten paths for us today, talking about London's famous execution sites. As Nick was saying, it's not always a matter of being a good guy or a bad guy that puts you at the receiving end of one of these executioners. It can just be being in the wrong place at the wrong time, having the wrong religion, being in support of the wrong king at the wrong moment and all that sort of thing. So we're going to look a little bit at some of the people who have ended up losing their lives in these places. But we're also, of course, more specifically going to look at the places themselves. Where do you find them in London? What little streets might you turn down and discover something quite grim and gruesome at the end of them in terms of history? Apologies if anybody's sitting down with their lunch or their dinner or whatever it might be. Hold your breath, hold your stomachs. We're going to be covering some pretty gruesome details as we go along. As you can tell by this image we have here of some poor chap getting chopped to pieces. I'll explain a bit more about that later on. Now, of course, there are lots of famous execution sites in London, and we're not actually going to be able to cover them all in the space of this 30-minute broadcast, because really any few hundred meters along the streets of London, you might come across a place where somebody lost their lives for one reason or another. One of the most famous execution sites, of course, is the Tower of London. We're going to finish up with that. But there are some other places quite famous in British history and in British folklore that you might not have heard of or come across before. So I'm going to deal with some of the most significant of those today. What we're looking at here is an overhead map of London. You can see the River Thames running through the sort of bottom right-hand side of the image there. Off to the left, you can see that green patch is Hyde Park, one of the largest open expanses in central London. And over right where my little red arrow is here, in the City of London, is our first execution site. Next to my little red arrow, you might be able to see a small sort of milky green box there. And that little box is the roof of Smithfield Market. We're going to zoom in a little bit closer there. There's that milky green box on the left-hand side. And you can see stretching away from it as well, the roof of the rest of the complex of Smithfield Market. And in the centre of the image, a roundabout with a few trees looking nice and green. Here it is today. As you can see, a few people enjoying a bit of peace and quiet on the benches there. It looks like a beautiful, peaceful place, somewhere you might go to have a little bit of a picnic or get a bit of peace and quiet in the middle of the bustling city that London is. But as mentioned, it has a dark past. It hasn't always been in the centre of an urban conurbation. In fact, if you go back several hundred years, it was outside, really, the walls of London. You can see in the very bottom right-hand corner of this image, some of the walls of the city there. It was an open space. There were tournaments held there, so you might come there for a fair, for entertainment. You might come there for the markets that were regularly held there, where you could purchase livestock or goods. You might have come there to visit the monastery, which was on the right-hand side, just to the right of those two people in the middle. You can see the words S. Bartholomew, St. Bartholomew, a beautiful church which still exists to this day. But also, you might have headed out there to witness an execution. If you were someone who was found on the wrong side of the law, that could have been murder, that could have been treason, it could have been really anything as bad as stealing somebody's coat or something like that. You might have found yourself signed up for a capital punishment, taken outside the city's walls, and have ended your life in this quite strange little place. We think the name Smithfield, by the way, comes from smooth field, a nice open spot where people could be executed. These executions weren't always terribly thought through and planned. One of the most famous individuals to have lost his life at Smithfield was this man in the middle, about to suffer under the blow of that sword. His name was Wat Tyler. And he was the leader of something known as the Peasants Revolt in 1381. He was rising up against the individual that you can see on the right-hand side wearing the crown. That's King Richard II. And Wat Tyler and his compatriots were campaigning against the poll tax and against what they saw as a series of injustices in the way that Britain was being governed. They marched to London. They met with Richard outside of the city at Smithfield. They presented their demands to him. It all seemed to be going really well until, according to accounts at the time, Wat Tyler called for a flagon of water, knocked back the water in a disgusting manner in front of the king. This caused some argument. It was felt he'd been disrespectful, and a fight ensued. And the gentleman you can see lifting a sword there was supposedly the Lord Mayor of London, about to bring that crashing down on poor old Wat Tyler's neck. He actually survived the initial attack, was rushed away to a poor man's hospital, but was tracked down, brought back to Smithfield, and had his head cleanly removed from his shoulders. Not a very happy end for him. But of course, the most famous person really to have lost their life at Smithfield is this individual, and this is a monument to him that actually still stands on the site. This is Sir William Wallace, who, if you've ever seen the movie Braveheart, you might be familiar with, a man who fought for Scotland at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1912-97, and who was captured ultimately by a traitor to his cause, brought back to England, and under Edward III suffered execution here in 1305. Not just any execution, by the way. He was sentenced to be hung, drawn, and quartered, which, if you've ever followed a bit of British history, is something you might know is to be best avoided wherever you can. One of the worst punishments that you could go through. You're hanged, you're emasculated, you're eviscerated, and then you are beheaded. And to give you a better sense of what that actually entails, I have an extract here of the death warrant of a man called Major General Harrison. Now, he was executed a long time after Sir William Wallace, but by the same method. In 1660, he was an individual known as one of the regicides. Again, if you know a bit about British history, you might know we had a civil war in the 17th century in which our King, Charles I, had his head chopped off, and Major General Harrison was one of the signatories of the death warrant of the king. And so When the monarchy was restored in 1660, the king's son, Charles II, came back to take the throne. You can imagine he wasn't too happy with the people who had had his dad executed. And so a similar fate awaited Thomas Harrison. This is his death warrant. It says, "That you be led to the place from whence you came, and from thence be drawn upon a hurdle to the place of execution. And then you shall be hanged by the neck, and, being alive, shall be cut down, and your privy members to be cut off, your entrails be taken out of your body, and you living, the same to be burnt before your eyes, your head to be cut off, your body to be divided into 4 quarters, and head and quarters to be disposed of at the pleasure of the king's majesty. And, as an afterthought, the Lord have mercy on your soul." Yes, this is quite a hideous and horrible thing to go through. It happened to William Wallace at Smithfield. Major General Harrison actually was executed in Trafalgar Square, what is today Trafalgar Square, Charing Cross at that time. But as you can see, not only do you have to go through being hung, but you also have to have your privy members cut off, not very pleasant, your entrails removed, burnt in front of you. And then your head, once it had been cut off, would be placed on a spike, possibly at London Bridge, possibly at one of the gates entering the city, possibly outside the Houses of Parliament. And the rest of your body would be sent off to the different far-flung corners of the country as a reminder to anybody who was plotting something that you don't want to mess with the King of England. Not a nice way to go, ladies and gentlemen. In the 1400s, executions of criminals and the like really moved away from Smithfield to another location, which we'll talk about in just a second. But in the 16th century, they had something of a revival here during the reign of this woman, Queen Mary I. She was a Catholic. She had become queen following the death of her younger brother, Edward VI, who had been a Protestant. And under him, during his reign, England had seen a number of transformations to its religious life, a number of Protestant transformations, which Queen Mary was not a fan of, as you can imagine. And so she created a series of individuals who became known as the Marian Martyrs, people who were executed at Smithfield in the majority because of their faith and their role in what she saw as the destruction of the Catholic faith in England. And if I take you back to this map of Smithfield we were looking at before, I mentioned there is St. Bartholomew's on the right-hand side, that church. And part of that still exists today. The church itself exists, and in front of it, this gatehouse. And legend has it, and I underscore the word legend quite heavily here, that this gatehouse was where Queen Mary liked to sit, to look out those windows, to feast, to enjoy food and wine, whilst she watched the plight of those poor martyrs being burnt at the stake for the things that they believed in. Just along from that, still existing as well, is this structure. This is actually the entrance to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, which still exists there. And you might be able to make out just above the archway a tiny, tiny little figure of King Henry VIII there. And you will recognize that, I hope, in this image, which is a depiction of the burning of martyr John Rogers. And you can see, if you look past the flames and the billowing smoke to the right-hand side, there's that tiny little statue of Henry VIII above the gatehouse. John Rogers was the vicar of St. Sepulchre's, which is a church nearby. He was also someone heavily involved in the translation of the Bible into English, a very Protestant ideal at that time. And as a result, he was the first martyr executed during the reign of Mary I. You can see he's very dramatically declaring, "Lord, receive my spirit," there, surrounded, of course, by a crowd, because in England, we were quite bloody and gruesome people at this time, and we enjoyed a good execution. People would come down to watch. You didn't have television, you didn't have the radio. This was entertainment for the masses, and so they'd have come to witness this moment. There's actually an incredible story of several people who were about to be burnt at the stake in 1558, when news arrived, literally just as the torch was about to touch the paper, that Queen Mary had died and had therefore been unable to sign their death warrant. And so they were spared right at the very last second. Can you imagine? So, Today, as I mentioned, you have this rather lovely little garden at Smithfield. If we take a closer look at that sculpture in the middle, you'll see that it's actually a statue of peace. It was installed in 1873 by the artist John Burney Phillip, and it brings, I think, a sort of nice reminder of the atrocities that took place there, whilst looking forwards to a more peaceful future that we enjoy today. But let's move away from Smithfield. As I mentioned, in the 1400s, executions of criminals and things like that moved away from Smithfield to a place called Tyburn, which you should be able to see my little red arrow there, right at the very top corner of Hyde Park. So if we zoom in, you can see here at the bottom, this green patch is the very corner of Hyde Park, and the road heading off in that direction is Park Lane, one of the purple places on a Monopoly board, a British Monopoly board. Off to the right, that is Oxford Circus, very famous Oxford Street, I should say, very famous shopping street. And in the middle, this little structure that you might be able to see from above is Marble Arch, designed by the architect John Nash, and something that people often look out for when they come to London. But ignoring all of those, I want you to look at this rather boring looking little pedestrian crossing in the middle of the road here, a place that people frequently wander over with their shopping bags, happy and full from a day out on Oxford Street without giving the space a second thought. And it was here that, until relatively recently, until the 18th century, public executions were held. And if we have a look at this little map, which is from John Rock's map of London in 1746, you'll see at the bottom there it says where soldiers are shot, which gives you a sense that deserters and people being court-martialed were executed there. But in the middle of the road, you can see what looks like a very strange little triangle with 3 legs just above the word Tyburn. And that was what was known as the Tibetan Tree. Here's an image of it. It replaced a real tree, which had once stood on that site. But when that died and sort of fell down, they replaced it with a structure that was designed specifically to be able to hang as many people at the same time as possible. Apparently, on one occasion, 24 men lost their lives. And Tyburn became a place that really was very much part of British folklore and British culture. This was where you ended up if you lived a life of crime, if you did something bad. And it features in folk music, in folk tales, a very famous folk song known as Jack Hall or Sam Hall, finishes with the lyrics, they took me up Tyburn Hill in a cart, in a cart. They took me up Tyburn Hill, and it was there that I made my will. The best of friends must part. Fare thee well, fare thee well. So a dark and like I say, a place that very much sort of overshadows British consciousness. Rather interestingly, one of the most famous people hung there, or hanged, I should say, was this man, Oliver Cromwell. And I say interestingly because he was not alive when he was hanged. As you can see from his dates here, he died in 1658. And he, of course, for those of you who don't know, was one of the main protagonists during the Civil War. He was the leader of the parliamentary forces, a Puritan. Charles I, as we mentioned earlier, had his head chopped off. And in 1658, Cromwell died, having lived a long and comfortable life towards the end. And Charles II, the son of the old king, was invited back to be king again. And he decided that even though Cromwell had died and was long since buried, he should be symbolically punished. And so his body was dug up, taken to Tyburn, and he was hung from the Tibetan Tree. And on that spot today, we have this quite sad, quite plain little memorial, the site of the Tyburn Tree. And if anyone glances down as they're hurrying along with their shopping, they get a little reminder of darker days past. In the 1780s, execution again moved, and it moved away from Tyburn and back down towards Smithfield, where it had begun. If we zoom in a little bit closer, you can see at the top of the image here, that's that roundabout we were looking at Smithfield. You can actually see the William Wallace Memorial marked on the map. And just down the street from Smithfield is this interesting structure. Perhaps underneath my arrow, you can see it says the Central Criminal Court, known in England today as the Old Bailey, a much more magnificent building than this image does justice, I have to say. But you can see all the way at the top there, the imposing figure of Lady Justice looking down on us all. And today, in a sense, I suppose we see that as a reassuring thing. You know, there's someone ensuring that justice is done, and this is a place where rights are wronged. But it wasn't always the case. Justice hasn't always been the engine for sort of righteousness as we see it today. It has in the past been an engine of the state, something that monarchs and kings and powerful people could turn to their own advantage. And the Old Bailey is built on the site of this. This is the Newgate prison, and this photo was taken in 1900, very shortly before it was closed in 1902 and then demolished in 1904, and the Old Bailey built in its place. As you can see, it's quite a grim looking building. There'd been a prison there since the 12th century, actually, in various forms. This version was built in the 18th century, designed to be as dark and depressing as possible to try and encourage people not to end up there, of course. Here's a depiction of some of those poor souls who ended up interred within, marching around, getting their bit of exercise in a dark, dirty, dimly lit courtyard. Famously, people often died in the jail from various ailments, from dysentery and disease. There were fleas, there were rats. It was a hugely unpleasant place to end up. And for some people, the result of your stay at Newgate was that you were executed. And that execution was public, and it took place just outside. And you can see in this image that a scaffold has been erected outside the prison, and again, a huge crowd has gathered. Now, these crowds were not there to engage in any form of sympathy. They were there to revel in the experience. And it was so unpleasant, so horrible to witness an execution, that many people were moved to write about it. And Charles Dickens, for example, one of our most famous authors, wrote a lot in his books about Newgate Prison and what happened to those people who committed wrongs there. He famously witnessed himself in 1849 an execution outside Newgate. And he was so horrified by what he saw, not the execution of justice as he saw it, but the reaction of the crowd, the fact that people enjoyed it and reveled in it and screamed and cheered and were camping out to secure their places for hours beforehand. He found that so revolting that he wrote to the Times and insisted that the government had a responsibility to ensure that these sentences were carried out in the quiet solemnity of the prison themselves. And by 1868, people largely agreed with him, and public executions came to an end, although, of course, we still had executions right up until 1969 in this country. So we've covered the three major sites of public execution. We must finish, of course, with the most famous site, and that is the Tower of London. And people have been executed here really pretty much consistently throughout our recent history. Here's the Tower of London itself, for those of you who don't know what it looks like. It's been a subject, of course, of some of our broadcasts before, so do go back through and have a look at some of them. And there are actually two execution sites at the tower. One is inside the tower, and you can see the little arrow pointing here. Within those walls, those sturdy walls, sits this monument, this memorial to those 10 individuals who have lost their lives. And those people were people who got a more private execution for whatever reason, including famously, of course, the wives of Henry VIII. There's a wonderful inscription on this monument. It says, "Reader, pause a while. On this spot, death cut away the light of many days," which I think always makes you pause and think. These, after all, you have to remember, were real people and suffered real tragedies. The most famous, probably this lady, Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, executed for treason. And this lady in this beautiful painting by Paul Delaroche, Lady Jane Grey, who was just 16 years old. She had been declared queen by many of the powerful people surrounding her. She lost her throne within 9 days to Queen Mary I, and she ended up losing her head very tragically on Tower Green as well. But you may not have realised there is another execution site at the tower just outside, and you should be able to see my other arrow there pointing at a spot on what was once Tower Hill. And you can see it has this lovely little monument preserved there. I actually think this is so tasteful and unobtrusive as a monument. It's quite lovely. Many individuals lost their lives on this site in full view, as I've said, of those baying members of the public who had come to attend and enjoy and buy souvenirs and all that sort of thing. Many individuals. One of the most famous, This man, Sir Thomas More, he was High Chancellor to Henry VIII, and he was a man who resisted Henry VIII's move to make himself the supreme head of the Anglican Church. Of course, England had been Catholic up until that point. Thomas More was a firm Roman Catholic, but the king, for his own political reasons, wanted to put himself in charge of the church. He wanted to remove the Pope's influence from England, and Thomas More refused to sign the Act of Supremacy, and that led to his downfall. He died under the axe at Tower Hill. His final words were, "I die the king's good servant and God's first." And for me, that really sums up, as Nick mentioned right at the beginning of all of this, that you could end up becoming a victim of the executioner in England for no reason other than your religion, than your political beliefs. And we think that we're politically divided today. Imagine the trouble it might have got you into in the past. And to sum that up, I think I'd like to finish with a little look at the memorial that stands here in Tower Hill. There's a beautiful plaque there which reads, "To commemorate the tragic history and in many cases the martyrdom of those who for the sake of their faith, country or ideals staked their lives and lost." Doesn't that sum it all up, ladies and gentlemen? So that has been a very quick run through of some of the most famous execution sites in London. As Nick mentioned, do pop any questions you might have down in the comments section, and we will do our best to answer them for you. Thank you.
Katie, thank you so much. That was fascinating. And it wasn't just one execution site, wasn't it? Most people think, oh, the Tower of London, that's where people were executed. But we forget there's so many different sites in London that people lost their lives. And you mentioned King Charles I. He had his own special execution site, didn't he?
He did, yes, outside the banqueting house at Whitehall. Very special, very unique, just for him. And I always find it fascinating that there's not a bigger memorial there. You'd think a spot where a king lost his life, there should be something, but there isn't even really a plaque. Just a small little bust of him around the corner in the wall that if you're not looking for, you might miss.
Absolutely, you think there'd be a great big red blue plaque on the wall or something, wouldn't you? Something indeed. Peter Allman says, interesting to note that Beatles were at number one when hanging was abolished.
Yes.
So we heard that hanging was abolished in the 1960s in this country. So there is no execution at all on the British statute now.
And actually, it was in 1969 that it was abolished as a punishment for murder, but it was still a punishment for treason all the way up until 1998, which makes you pause, doesn't it?
And another interesting fact, I know Fiona's always mentioning, because of course she is the expert on London transport, but the fact that you could actually go and visit the last public execution in this country, and you could get there by tube, because the tubes were running at the time of the last public execution.
Do you know, I actually can't get on the tube without thinking about that.
Now, Ruby in Canada has asked, when did they actually stop drawing and quartering the guilty? Was it during Queen Victoria's reign?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I mean, certainly as that talk has revealed, it was going on right up until the 17th century, certainly. But I don't know of any examples happening in the 19th century. I don't know if you have any idea.
No, Eddie said a similar thing, where the regicides, so the people who killed King Charles, were the last to be hung, drawn and quartered. I believe that the punishment remained on the statute books right up until the 19th century, but was often commuted. So people didn't actually suffer, although they were sentenced to be hung, drawn and quartered. The punishment didn't actually take place. But when the last one to actually take place was probably in the 18th century, I should think.
It's quite extreme, isn't it? And I think, the people who've suffered that fate tend to be people who specifically rebel against the king. So, but I know certainly that in the 18th century, a lot of the Jacobite rebellers, for want of a better word, were executed by axe. So were not hung, drawn, and quartered. So perhaps it was going out of fashion at that time. That's a horrible thing to say, isn't it? Going out of fashion to be hung, drawn, and quartered. but there you are.
I mean, the whole principle, I suppose, was to to give an example to people so that they wouldn't
Absolutely.
commit this treason. So it was something that will be in the back of your mind if you thought, oh, I might
Always.
rebel against the king this week, or perhaps I won't. You never know what will happen. Fascinating talk. Eddie, yes, he says he thinks the legislators were the last ones to be hung, drawn, and quartered.
I think so.
Fascinating, says Maria. A grim but interesting and fascinating. It is a grim story, but it's very much part of our history. Not just in this country, but around the world. We've got people from Naples, people from Venice, all around the world watching us. Thank you so much for that. If you want to know more about Katherine, then the easiest way is to go and have a look at her website, or go to the Guide London website, and I can probably find that for you here. If I do that, and I do that, and I do that, you can see Katherine's page there, which gives you a little bit about her, and you can search. You can find out some of the wonderful reviews you get for your talks, and also the availability as well. And also on the webpage, you'll be able to find all about the different tours that our guides offer. So at the moment, London is starting very gradually to open up after this lockdown, and some of the major sites are going to be reopening in May and June, so we will be able to take people to visit some of the sites in person, hopefully before long. But in the meantime, you can always book a virtual tour with one of our guides to get a little taste of what you can see, and then when the pandemic is over, you can come and visit us for real. So just go to the website guidelondon.org.uk, search for tours, see all the different types of tours you can see in London. And if you're interested in particularly in execution sites, then I'm sure whichever guide you hire will be able to show you some of the main execution sites in London. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you so much for Katherine for talking to us today about this wonderful, interesting part of British history. We'll be back at the same time next Tuesday, and next week we hope to be looking at some of the locations associated with the television series, the Netflix series Bridgerton. I know it was very popular all around the world. There are many locations around London that were used in the making of the series, so join us next week and we'll have a look at some of those. But from the two of us for the moment, goodbye.